Welcome to the Prosthetics and Orthotics podcast with Brent Wright and Joris Peels. Hello, everyone. My name is Joris Peels, and this is the Prosthetics and Orthotics podcast with Brent Wright. How you doing, Brent?
Hey, I'm doing well. I'm super excited for this podcast. It's going to be a little bit different than what we've had in the past, but that's a good thing.
Okay. So who do we have on today?
Oh man, we've got Ben Ryan on today, and I've followed Ben and his journey for quite a while. His son is actually has a below the elbow amputation, and so Ben has just shared his journey with a lot of people, and so I'm excited for him to share that, just about how he gets care for his son's name is Saul, but also what he has done to help Saul. Ben has actually taken to Fusion 360 and helped create some activity-specific devices for Saul, and I think he can provide us a lot of input from not only the parent side, the design side, and then obviously his um, son's side. So it's going to be an interesting conversation today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Okay. Perfect. So, what made you kind of start to think, hey, I'm going to make these devices myself? What was the reason you got started with OMP yourself? Let's say from your house.
So my son's was a traumatic amputation. He was 10 days old, following a suspected forceps injury from a complex delivery. So I had about 6 weeks of reading time. And my background is in psychology, so I used to teach psychology and psychopathology for 12 years. And I decided to take, I suppose I was intellectualizing, maybe a defense mechanism to handle the emotions of what I was going through when Saul lost his arm. But I was very much keen to understand the kind of life my son was going to live and the kinds of problems he was going to have, not just as a child, but into old age. So I was researching. I was lucky to have still active subscriptions to Web of Science and Science Direct. So I took a proper research angle and was looking at meta-analyses of successful interventions and the kinds of problems that can happen over the life period. And the first thing that struck me was the rejection rate in infancy. And I was very keen to understand what this was and looked into it and found that around about the age of 2.5 years, there was a sudden drop-off point. I started to look around this and looked at studies of prosthetic rejection, only in upper limb. And I came to the conclusion that the wrong approach was being taken. Not enough was being done in the early years. And to try and sum up what could take an hour really to give a decent explanation of, in the first 2.5 years of life, the brain destroys half of the nerves that are available. So you're born with about 160 to 200 billion neurons. By the time you get to 3 years of age, those have been ruthlessly eliminated. So it's a question of use it or lose it to some extent. And I found that kind of tallied up with the point in time where children tend to put down their devices, never to pick them up again. So I wanted to make sure that I did something for my son that would improve his chances of accepting a device. So here I was at home with a 1-month-old baby, still with stitches in his arm after the amputation. And I wanted to try to encourage acceptance of a device. So I made something out of foam, and Sol would wear that every day for about 15 minutes and play with it. I was contacting other psychologists that I knew, neurologists, to try and get some support or advice on what direction to take it, but it seemed to work. By the time Sol was a year old, he was very used to having a soft arm put on and taken off that he used to play with. And we were very lucky to have an excellent prosthetist with 38 years experience. So Sol's first socket fit really well, but I think part of that was because he behaved so well during the first appointment. It wasn't alien to him. So initially, that's all I was concerned about, was how can I get this little boy to accept a device? It started to snowball from there then. So that's when lots of other different things and different ideas came into play. And of course, 3D printing.
But okay, so I like this acceptance thing, because I think if you weren't a psychologist, you may have just missed that. I mean, I think a lot of people may have tried to engineer a solution or something like that, but you were like, oh no, he has to actually like get used to it. He has to and was that difficult? Is that something you need to do? Did you need to do this like every single day, or
Yeah, every
was this
day.
like a discipline kind of thing?
I didn't want it to be regimented. It would
Okay,
be
okay.
centered around. We always took the lead from Sol. Every parent will know that there's a point in the day where the child kind of goes hyperactive and just wants to bang everything in their toys. So what I
Mm-hmm.
noticed it was Sol had, for the first month of his life, his left arm had been either in a vacuum or um, some other wires and things hanging out of his arm, so he wasn't really using it. And when he was lying
Mm-hmm.
on his back under two hoops, which with toys suspended from him, he was only reaching for them with his right hand. Now, what I knew
Ah,
about
okay.
brain development was that all these
Mm-hmm.
early, seemingly unimportant twitches and random spasms and things are actually how the nervous system is shaped, how you
Mm-hmm.
get sensory correspondence between the eyes and the hands as well, and also a little known sense called proprioception, which is vital to mastery of prosthetic devices. I thought that had
Mm-hmm.
been completely overlooked. And I can understand why. The cost of doing something like I did clinically, medically, would run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. But if it's something
Mm-hmm.
that parents could do at home, and I would really urge many more to follow the same
But
path that I did.
is it like, if I would have a similar situation, if I had a child in a similar situation, would this be can I download an ebook? What how would I do this? Or how would I, is there someone that does this, or?
No,
Uh,
nobody does this. I'm lucky to have also been working with several universities in the UK, and there's a professor called Samit Chakrabarti who has been studying over the videos that I post of Sol's development all the way from when he was a year old, and he says that Sol has abilities which defy medical science. According to the understanding of how the brain works, Sol does things that he's not supposed to be able to do, and they're very
okay.
subtle things. So I
Like
do
what? Like
believe
what?
that just in how he's getting feedback in a way that we don't fully understand when he goes to grab an object. So when Sol had a passive prosthesis with just a semi-closed fixed silicon hand,
Mm-hmm.
I used to practice holding my finger out for him to try and loop it. So he would
Mm-hmm.
loop the hand over the top. And one day I noticed that the TV had caught his attention, but he was still looping my finger successfully. He would partially
Mm-hmm.
register it visually,
Mm-hmm.
and he seemed to be able to then, even though he's missing more than almost half an arm, he was
Mm-hmm.
able to guide a 230-gram prosthesis with a heavy silicon hand on the end onto the target every time. So
Yeah. Without
that
looking as well, or?
without looking, he'd register it first, so he'd see it with his
Yeah.
eyes, he'd represent where that was spatially, and then he
Yeah.
could turn his head away and loop my fingers. So that should be impossible.
But why is that? Why is that? Okay, why is that impossible? I'm not like,
Uh,
I sometimes have an idea where things are, and where, it's kind of like a little. I would just think it's like a muscle memory thing or something. What, or is it?
it's
Why is it impossible?
There are special nerve sensors in all of our limbs around the joints, which describe to the brain what position and orientation and what space that limb is located in.
Yeah.
And I mean, having looked at other case studies as well, there was a patient, a grown man, who was able to demonstrate a similar effect. And it turned out, after much research, that actually he was using temperature as an indication of where his arm was in space. So the tiny
What?
difference in temperature from his
Yeah.
armpit, from the arm to the chest, was enough feedback to provide useful information. And it seems that the brain will do that. If there is any information available that can help, then the brain will use it, or pick up on it. So it's only that the traditional models are probably not as accurate as they could be. I mean, Sol isn't doing
Mm-hmm.
anything supernatural, but it means that
Mm-hmm.
there's a good deal more information taken in by the brain. And I think that the kind of structured fun activities that I did with him,
Mm-hmm.
it was always, fun and games and playing, rather than, I
Mm-hmm.
never sat there firmly telling him what to do. It was always guided through play. But I do believe
Mm-hmm.
that was probably the most significant thing I've ever done for him. I've done plenty of things since,
Mm-hmm.
but he is the only child that I know who wears the prosthesis from morning till night, uses it intuitively.
Mm-hmm.
He'll kind of reach behind him and grab the chair with the prosthesis and pull the chair under his
Mm-hmm.
legs to sit down at the table. And again, that shouldn't be possible.
Mm-hmm. And children normally, okay. So what's the problem normally with children? Then they just like, they hate it, or they don't feel it's part of them, or they just don't know, or is it like more of a sense thing that they don't know?
I don't think there's a hard and fast rule, because
Okay.
when you're talking about upper limb impairment, you could be talking about anything. I'm specifically
Mm-hmm.
speaking to short below the elbow amputee
Okay. Okay.
children here, I imagine. But
Well, and I think a lot of it also revolves around what we don't know, like the doctors don't know. So
mhm.
I know here in the U.S., a lot of times there will be a little bit of a wait to get a prosthesis. They're going to be there, so they'll say something to the effect of, "Hey, well, let's see what they end up doing. Every child is going to make adaptations, and then what we'll do is we'll make an activity-specific device for them." What's
Hmm.
interesting around Ben's story and Saul's story is Ben was like, "Well, that may be the case that he may find that going without an arm sometimes is better."
Hmm.
But Ben is saying, I think there's some development that can happen if there is some sort of arm. Now, it was not an arm like what, something super advanced, but it was something that Saul had the opportunity to not only play and use and develop as he was aging, and that's data I think that is, priceless, that we don't have anywhere in any of the literature or anything of that
Hmm.
soon of intervention and how that can make a difference for prosthetic use. So those are the two extremes. Like Ben is saying, I'm going to give Saul the best chance in both directions, right? With the arm, without, and doctors are here in the U.S., at least the ones that I've interacted with, are more, hey, let's find out what the child is going to need. And so
Hmm.
you really take out 50% of the potential activities, right? When you don't introduce a prosthesis early.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
And
going back to the
uh,
psychology of it, I mean, we know much more about adolescence. So I mentioned brain pruning earlier on, the elimination of nerves that are not used and the strengthening of nerve pathways which are used. So we know that going into puberty, there is another period. I mean, continually throughout our lives, we are unlearning things to make the brain more efficient. But going into puberty, we know that if you haven't mastered a musical instrument, gymnastics, debating skills, anything that requires skill, if it's not mastered going into puberty, then you're never really going to be winning gold medals for it afterwards. So I was just applying that, what we know about adolescence, to the much more rigorous pruning period, which happens at 2.5 years. So I knew that it wasn't just enough to get a device for my son by 2.5. He had to have been trained to use it by 2.5. So at least 8 months of
okay.
use, I would say, would have been important. Um,
Yeah. Okay.
and then the other thing, and there are practical things as well. I knew that the humerus wouldn't grow as long if there wasn't weight suspended on the end of it. So I knew that just having a passive weight added to the end of the stump was going to provide some kind of medical benefit. And now looking at him as a 7-year-old, his shoulders, there is a tiny noticeable a bit of muscle atrophy, but that it's not nowhere near as. I mean, I've helped something in the order of 60 children now, so I've had close contact with 60 children with upper limb requirements, and the muscle wastage is so apparent. And by the age of 3, if you even one of the lightest devices that Brent and I could make, it's too heavy. So I thought it made sense to go in as quickly as I could, so that this was never something that Sol would have to get used to. He would come into consciousness, if you like, knowing that he had an adapted left arm.
Okay. Okay. And what? Wait, I'm going to ask you more of a personal question. What's it like as a parent? Because you seem to have kind of like gone into kind of doctor mode essentially to solve this. And but as a parent, this must be kind of heartbreaking every day, kind of thing, right? Or at least initially.
It was. I cried quite a lot for the first 2 years, and I was told by medical staff that with both my partner and I, because it was a traumatic birth and everything that we'd been through, we'd both been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress.
Oh
So
wow.
there is a selfish element to this. This was partly helping me heal and adjust. That I could feel useful, that I was able to do something.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. And and did it also like and at one point you're going to have a conversation with your kid about this, right? Does this come up? Does he notice it? Is it how does that work out? If the kid, is somebody going to make fun of him at one point? What's this the first
No,
conversation about this?
he's got a very thick skin. So one of the things that we knew that Saul was going to have to face was the psychology of living with one arm.
Hmm.
And we've raised him to have a thick skin. He has a younger brother who teases him about all aspects of his life. And I just think it's good for kids to grow up robust and not have a sensitivity. I had
Hmm.
seen, I mean, some of the earliest children in 2017 that I went to the homes to scan the limb would come into the room with their arm behind their back, ashamed of it, hiding it.
Hmm.
And I did not want that to be the case. So in the
Hmm.
end, I created something of a diva. Sol loves being famous. He loves knowing that people in 120 odd countries know who he is and contact his dad. He likes knowing that he's special, and he certainly doesn't have any of the, because one of the long-term negative things I was trying to avoid was depression around the limb.
Mm-hmm.
So he doesn't have any of that. He's very, very content. In fact, if you were to ask him now, would he like to have two hands, he'd probably say no.
Okay. But how do you do that then? I mean, so what's the conversation like? I mean, like, talk us through this, because it seems
Yeah.
like it's a really intricate thing you've done here, right?
So I watched very keenly as the prosthetist took the cast. And when we went to the first appointment when Sol was 11 months of age, we were told that there was an occupational therapist there to physically restrain Sol, that we needed to keep him still while we were taking the cast, because if there was a tiny movement, it would affect the cast, and therefore the resulting socket wouldn't fit. And I explained what I'd done. I'd already been working for a year with soft prosthetics. And I just said, Sol, stump up, which is what I say when I'm putting his arm on. And he lifted his arm up, and they took a perfect cast. He just sat there, good as gold, didn't move at all. There didn't need to be an occupational therapist there, just mum was fine. And that was a really critical point. So then we had 2 years for me to learn how to make a digital socket myself. And the first time Sol ever spoke, he was 2, I think. He was just coming up to his 2nd birthday, and I'd been trying multiple check sockets, and he'd go, no, 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 no. And then he looked at me one day, his eyes went wide, and he said, it fits properly. And that was the first ever verbal feedback he'd given me. And I must admit, it is a lot easier now that he is articulate and able to explain how it feels and so on. But obviously, when a child's very young, it's difficult to know if you've put something on which is uncomfortable. How do they express that other than crying? But Sol is able now to give me very good feedback on what he likes. Some of the advice that I'd received was to try to keep the weight of the prosthesis approximately the same as the volume that had been lost. But Sol rejects that. He says he likes to have a slight weight at the end of the hand, so he uses a split hook. But the device that he's wearing now is something like 190 grams versus the official equivalent that we've had made by a prosthetist is something like 450 to 550 grams. So the lighter the better.
Okay.
And again, all of this feedback comes from Sol, so it's a user experience design.
Okay. Yeah. But rather than seeing him as like a patient, which often is kind of a very passive kind of thing you undergo, you're doing it much more. Well, I guess like a psychologist. We're in a psychologist. It's kind of much more of an interactive kind of like working together thing. Is that kind of also intentional? I know the answer.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I have looked at a lot of other things. So I looked at the entire open source options, and that to me seemed it had been top down designed by engineers trying to shoehorn a solution they'd come up with to fit other children. And I knew immediately that the enable arms and the other arms that you see that are 3D printed would not be suitable. But he needed to stick closer to the medical model. Even the fingers for the first 2.5 years didn't open or close. He was getting so much use from it just as a limb, reaching his arms forward to open double doors. If he fell over, he would put his arms out and take the weight of the fall through both arms. So I kind of ignored really what the professionals were telling me to do, and went and took my lead from what Sol seemed to need.
Yeah, and also did he? I like the feedback element here that you're really like discussing with him, and he's like kind of the expert on that. Is that also help with the ownership aspect, of kind of him making it believe that he's part of this process?
Yeah, he knows he's the chief technical director for Ambionics, and we're partners. It was one of the most difficult things was the first time I made an arm for another child. He got very jealous. So I always had to make whatever arm I'd given away to other children. Sol had to have something more special, something more unique, and that kind of helped with his psychology. But the next thing that I wanted to do was to try and introduce. My aim was to try and introduce function by the time Sol was 8 months of age. That was over ambitious, and you've already picked up that I didn't succeed with doing that. But for the first 4 years of Ambionics, I was trying to cobble together a hydraulic prosthesis, a body-powered hydraulic prosthesis. So having looked at how he handled objects naturally, he'd put them under his paw on the affected side, and he'd crook his neck, and he'd be struggling with his eyes to try and look at something which should have been in his kind of, on his lap. He should be manipulating objects in front of him, safe distance from the eyes, and not crooking the neck. So I wanted to try and take that natural instinct to put things under the paws and replace the object with a hydraulic sack. And as he squeezed that with his arm, then a mechanical thumb would grab an object in the front. We got so far with that design, but my original intention for that was for it to be something that would take him from 8 months to 2 years. I don't think it was really useful for children much older. But the first commercial patented one of those was sold in 2020 in the January, just before COVID. There was an above elbow child who wanted a hydraulic prosthesis. So through a company I was working with, we made it. But I just take inspiration from nature and take inspiration from looking at Sol and how he does things. And to hell with how things are done already, I wanted to see if I could just make something that was specifically for Sol. And we seem to have settled on a system. He much prefers body power to myoelectrics. He's been fully trained on the myoelectric device in our local limb centre, but he's unimpressed with it. He doesn't like the lack of feedback. And I'm now doing I'm helping my local university, Bangor University, to do a motion analysis study using body-powered prehensors and split hooks on neurotypical patients. So it's kind of an overlay prosthesis hand. So we can study how people adapt to the constraints of prosthesis.
Oh, where have you landed as far as the materials that you're using to 3D print, some of the design, like the most recent stuff that you're doing for Sol? Can you share some of that?
Yeah, sure. So I found VarioSure. I think it was Brent that actually introduced me to it on LinkedIn. So I got some VarioSure from ColourFab. So this is expanded urethane, thermoplastic urethane. And dialing it in took a few months. When I got the design right, it is the socket material that Sol prefers. However, to print the entire forearm and socket in one go would be a 13-hour, 14-hour print. If anything goes wrong, it's very expensive material. So I've switched now to a modular system where the socket protrudes past the end of the stump by a couple of inches, but then it attaches to an ABS tube, which is actually electrical conduit. It's a short length of electrical conduit with a simple screw through, and then the split hook is connected to the end. There's a brass quick release mechanism, which is from RSL Steeper in the UK. And it just has a polypropylene attachment and an M8 threaded connector. So you can switch out the split hook for a bicycle hand or a drumstick holder that I've made for him. So we really have a 3-part system where the terminal device can be swapped out. The length of the shaft in the middle is very inexpensive and can be swapped out as Sol's arm grows longer. And then every 3 or 4 months, I make a new socket to attach to the end out of VarioSure.
And is the split hook one that you designed, or is it something else?
No, it's an aluminium one. So again, I think this is from RSL Steeper in the UK. It's not his preferred method for using body power. We're trying to get him into voluntary close now. We've is it Bob Radowski from TRS, Phil Howe?
Yep.
That's Sol's hero. we watched some of the videos on how to use it, and we're completely sold by the efficiency of using a voluntary closed prehensor. So I had to go at making one, but it's something that I'm continuing to develop. But at the moment, Sol is very happy with a split hook that isn't connected to a cable. He doesn't wear a harness with it. He just uses it as a passive limb. But we're now going to move into training through the university program that we're doing. We're going to try and find out how to really optimize a prehensor. And I think the most important thing that I've been overlooking is flexioning in the wrist and rotation of the wrist. So the device I made this time last year was a multi-jet fusion PA12 nylon socket with a outer socket with a VarioSure liner and a harmonic drive wrist that he could operate with a momentary switch. And I think something like that, if I was going to introduce myoelectric into Sol's Divine, it would be to control the wrist. So I would like full linear control of a wrist so that he can precisely manipulate objects without having to, operate a clumsy lever on the side of the hand or manually shift it.
So, well, you mentioned a drumstick. I know some of the story, but I know yours would get a kick out of the drumming story. So share some of that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So through LinkedIn, we had one of Sol's fans contact us when they heard that Sol was interested in taking up drums, and they bought Sol a drum kit, a really nice Ludwig drum kit. I designed a drumstick holder attachment that could easily swap out on the end of his existing arm, and called the newspapers to try and drum up a little bit of awareness. And one member of the audience happened to be the mother of the very famous one-handed drummer Rick Allen from Def Leppard.
Ah,
So in February, Sol had a 1 hour lesson with the Def Leppard drummer, and we're going to meet again and hopefully go to a concert at some point later in the year.
that's lovely. That's super lovely.
But
And so,
really nice guy. Really nice guy.
yeah, I can imagine. And wait, so this publicity thing, you said it helps like psychologically. What does it do? I mean, a lot of people maybe would be a bit shy about doing this, or a bit like kind of like, because that publicity, it's not just one email or something. You need to like put a lot of work into that as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that important to you? Is that important to you both? Does it give you a lot more connections? What's the logic behind that?
The logic simply to grow the network. I've put everything, including all of the files that me and Sol find useful, on it's a free online shop through our YouTube. So we have a YouTube channel called Ambionics UK. I put directions on there on how to take a 3D scan from a cast, how to model a check socket, how to print, etc. So for other families. Over the last few years, from 2017, when we first did a crowdfund, we did an embargoed press release for March the 1st, and we didn't expect it to be as big as it did, but 125 countries donated. I was doing interviews everywhere, for the New York Times all the way through to South Africa, Australia, and families from all around the world now, when they find out, either in the 20-week scan or when the child's born, that there's an upper limb difference, I seem to be the first port of call. And what I was hoping to do is to open up the non-profit so that I could employ staff to be able to manage all of this. We were getting between 4 and 8 inquiries a week, and it was taking a lot of time. So I wanted to try and grow the business, but the original advice that I had was to use the patent to leverage investment, and that just completely failed for whatever reason, probably because I'm too close to the subject matter. I don't belong in this industry. I'm not qualified, no experience. I was just a dad with quite an arrogant approach to dealing with his son's limb loss. But what I really want to do is to grow the non-profit so that it is open sourced, but under the watchful eye of clinical professionals. I don't believe this is something that parents should do without a prosthetist. And it's the first question I ask is, can you get to a prosthetist?
Yeah.
And then we can work together.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's very important to me to share the knowledge that Sol and I have put together. It would be brilliant if I could make this my career and draw an income from it. Sadly, that hasn't happened yet, but I do manage to get by, as Brent mentioned, with some public speaking. So I tend to make quite a lot of traction with companies like Unilever, Hitachi, Microsoft, I think was mentioned, Autodesk. I've done some public speaking for those, and that kind of keeps the wolf from the door, allows me to pay the mortgage, and allows me to spend as much time as I can in my workshop, which is where I think I'm best placed.
So you should have been an engineer all along, maybe, huh?
I come from a family of engineers. Yes, I rejected. My dad wanted me to go into an engineering company with him and my brother. I said no. I wanted to study psychology. They said you'll never get a job with psychology, and it will never be useful to you. And I'm glad to say they were wrong.
and so,
but I would have been a lot wealthier if I'd have gone into the business.
always. But okay, so now so what advice? Okay, so first off, like apart from like contacting you and stuff, what advice would you give me if I had to assume a child and stuff like that? I mean, what should I do? What are the most important things for me to do to really make the long-term health of my kid better? Let's say.
I have a consultation with somebody who can look at and make an assessment of the limb. There are too many examples that I can think of where there has been a circulation issue or something which would prohibit the intervention that I did. And you can't just assume that one short arm is the same as another short arm. You need, ideally, medical oversight should be the first thing. From there, I explain to families the steps that I took with the soft foam, and I have produced a case study which I'm still editing. But what I really like to do is to emphasize the importance of early intervention above anything else, I suppose. And then, yes, the wonders of 3D speak for themselves, but I think the most important thing is that early intervention. And I think, having worked with a European company, we did a small informal trial, but we saw that the rejection rates, i.e. the number of children returning for a second device, wasn't 70% rejection, it was 84% acceptance using the techniques that we were using. So I'd like to continue doing that and work with families. Yes, and these were children who were older than the age of 2 as well, so I imagine the numbers would be closer to 100 if those congenital children had received some kind of an intervention from basically as soon as they're able to play with toys, which is as soon as they're home from hospital, really.
Okay. That's a huge finding as well. I usually don't have that big swings in experimental data generally.
I have to say there were only there were less than 30 children involved, so it's not generalizable, and it was informal. There were no special measures taken or anything like that. It's just I think it points in the right direction, though. I think that you would find, clinical trial I don't have $450,000 for, but I think that the work that I've done with other children and other families that I'm working with at the moment as well. So there's a mother in China and a family in Costa Rica and another family as well in Slovenia who've done exactly what I did with the soft arms. And they say that their prosthetists, their OTs are amazed with the development. And they say, well, this is because of what we've learned from Ben and Sol.
Mm-hmm. And why not charge them? I mean,
I can't charge anybody for a medical service because I don't have qualification. I am allowed to make sockets, but I can't call myself a prosthetist. So wherever possible, I would rather work with people like Brent, good people like Brent, and prosthetists who are perhaps considering getting into digital but see massive headaches. I'd like to try and encourage people to take advantage of this new technology, and maybe see some of the shortcomings as well of the turnaround time. I mean, the fastest device that Sol ever had issued under the NHS in the UK was 4 months, and that was his first device. The longest was 11 months, and obviously that's ridiculous for a child under 5 to wait 11 months for a device. And of course, if that device gets broken, it's the same time. So I think there are things that families can do, and don't just accept that your child is going to adapt, because the adaptations that the child will make in response to not having a prosthesis will have cumulative downstream effects, arthritis, curvature of the spine, and so on. So I'd rather people look at this holistically and think of it as a cradle to the grave thing. What are the best things that you can do in the formative years that will help reduce the strains and wear and tear on the body in later years?
Okay. So I was like, and that holistic path. So we've got some good advice, like work with a prosthetist. Think of it holistically. Think of it like kind of like as a fitting into your life. I think it's also the psychological element. I think it's logical for you to do this, but I do tend to think it's kind of like an afterthought in this kind of thing, especially in the traumatic stuff. It just kind of seems like, oh, if you have problems with it, then yeah, by all means, go to a psychologist. It should be much more part and parcel of the whole treatment, in my opinion. But
I think so, and I think that even the open source devices, the kind of the gimmicks that you see printed by hubs of people who are good willing, that does provide a lift in the child's psychology. So when they're given a device and they're made to feel special, that does open them up and it makes them feel happy. Mm-hmm. So there is some value to it, but the problem I think with open source devices is that when they fail, and they will, or they cause an injury as they do, then it puts people off real prosthetics. So I think there needs to be more of an alignment between what the open source market are trying to offer and bring that more into line with the medical model.
Yeah, totally. And I think also like what I can't stop thinking about the fact that the idea is we're going to get an extra person in the room to restrain him for his first prosthetic treatment. Yeah. That to me just sounds like a completely silly thing. I mean, I was a kid. I had a bad experience with a dentist once. It put me off of going to the dentist for like years. It was a super traumatic thing for me to go to the dentist. And before that, it had been no problem whatsoever. So, imagine then, especially at a really, really young age, and then you don't have that much experience with doctors, and all of a sudden there's going to be a person restraining you. That's not going to make you're going to hate going to that office,
Yeah. Possibly, yeah. I imagine. I mean, I have to say they were both two lovely characters, and it would never have been an unpleasant experience. But the idea was for the OT to try and keep him still, to physically restrain him just while the cast was going on. And I hear stories from other families to say that they fidgeted, they screamed, they didn't like the wet feel of the plaster, and they weren't able to take a successful cast. So,
but that's something that you could try at home, right? Could you practice that at home just to give the kid an idea, like, hey, this is what we're going to do? Because that's just plaster of Paris, right? That's like
Initially, I didn't use plaster. So initially, I used a Microsoft Xbox 360 Kinect scanner, which was really crappy resolution. But again, because background in psychology, I know that once a child's gone into REM sleep, so when their eyes are moving back and forth, usually about 90 minutes after they go to sleep, they're paralyzed. So they can't move, they can't twitch. So my partner and I got the first data, if you like, or the first
Mm-hmm.
scan data,
Mm-hmm.
while Sol was asleep. So, and again, I think there's a lot to be said for that. However, scanning on its own, I don't think is sufficient to be able to take account of soft tissue compression and so on. So for someone like me who is prepared to just keep on going and going, I think I'd made possibly up to 20 check sockets, 2 hours ago, lots of plastic burning, lots of electric burning before I got the first one. It's not a commercially viable route, I don't think. So then we switched to casting. So I'd learned quite a lot from the excellent people I'd seen on LinkedIn and on YouTube, like Drew Myers, Brent, and so on, and saw how they took casting and got some inside track, got some tips. And we took the first cast in November. And I won't go back to just limb scanning again. Now it's so much better to take a scan and get a positive.
Okay, that's interesting.
But again, that is something that can be done quite cheaply at home for less than $20, I think.
Yeah, that's right. But no, I was thinking like literally like to practice, to not even to take the thing, but to know that when they go in for the real scan, the kids at least used to the plaster, used to the process.
Oh, of course. I think probably I should have done that. I think I was so scared by plaster because of the corrections that needed to be done and the knowledge that needed to be done. But possibly, maybe I should have just got him dirty and.
I just think this is something people do. Yeah.
That might be something. Yeah, I might pass that advice on. Yeah,
that could be interesting. I don't know what it would do, but it could be interesting. And then, so what kind of equipment do you use? So I like that you don't like scanning. I think that's a really interesting feedback. And the people are like always saying it's the future, and then some people isn't, and then. I think it's too complicated as well. So that's interesting. What kind of 3D printers? We heard you do MGF and you do some various sorts. So you use FDM as well.
Yes, I have a Prusa. I have two Prusas, in fact. The Mark 2.5, brilliant little workhorse. I've never had to level the bed, which is something that I know I would never be able to accept on another printer. So there are better printers out there, but this one's done me quite well. And I do still use scanning. So I scan the positive, but I have a RevoPoint pop scanner. So it has a little turntable. So rather than worry about tracking and things now, I literally set it up, set it to revolve, come back in 20 minutes, and I've got really, really nice scan data.
Okay.
And it seems it's very accurate as well. So we're at 0.3 millimeter accuracy, I think.
Okay. And then, and that's it? Like printer wise, you don't use anything else?
The computer. So in order to do the scanning, it needs to be, I was very, very lucky. In fact, this is another part of the story that tends to come out when I give a public speech. A policeman, detective chief inspector of the local police, had heard what I was trying to do from a financial advisor friend of his who was in school with me. And he came forward and said, "What do you need?" And I said, "Well, I want to have a go at trying to use SolidWorks, but it's £10,000 for a seat." Somebody else had pointed out Fusion 360 might work, but I would need a graphics loaded machine to do it. So without even thinking, he just bought me a £4,000 laptop, which I'm using to this day. I wouldn't be here without the kindness of lots and lots of people. But computing power is important.
Yeah, okay. I think a lot of people don't understand it. And also then, walk us through some more resources that you use and stuff. Like, I mean, okay, you're finding people on LinkedIn, which I think is interesting because there are a lot of 3D printing people there. And Brent is very hard to avoid on LinkedIn as well.
Yep.
Sorry,
no, that's good, dude. That's good. That's good. That's a community. Are there other places where you learn things and all that?
There were a few YouTubers who became my go-to. I think Thomas Salander, I think his name is, a German chap. He gives amazing reviews on all kinds of different filaments and things. But I actually found that making contact, because when I originally did a press release, there was such an obvious fit with Autodesk because I was using their software, and they helped me to launch the crowdfund. But I would say that one of the most important things is trying to get help from people who know. So by introducing to Autodesk, I became a part of the Future of British Manufacturing, and I got to go and see cutting edge technology in lots of their exhibitions and Autodesk University, but also I went to see their premises in Birmingham and looked at modern, what a modern factory might look like. So I was always trying to think, how might my designs feed into this technology which is becoming available? So I was very, very lucky to be right on the cutting edge through Autodesk, seeing what was coming over the hill. For example, technologies like multi-jet fusion, which then became quite popular. It helped me to to continue, even though I knew I was using inferior materials on an FDM, I knew that that wasn't always going to be the case, and at some point I'd swap out. And the switch to multi-jet fusion was just probably the most significant leap. The material is fantastic. The technology is fantastic. It's briefly disappointed by the fact that the color wasn't, full color printing didn't seem to be as good as it was originally promised, because that is an important thing for children. But yeah, you can have prostheses in any color you like as long as they're black.
Okay, yeah. Well, Rent is working on that as well with the HP color machines, at least for now, while they're still available. And what do you like? Okay, you're trying to create kind of like a community, right? So you've got a site and a YouTube and all that. I think on the PR front, you seem to be set with just the YouTube and that kind of thing, and your social media stuff and outreach.
Yeah.
But are there real community tools you're lacking, or ways of working together with people? So I can imagine just sharing files is a little bit more complicated than maybe we'd like it to be, that kind of thing.
Well, what I would really love to do is we're at 580 subscribers at the moment. Once I get to 1,000 subscribers, then I'll be able to have more interaction with the community. And so we just keep chipping away at it. We're trying to produce more videos to try and get new users to come along. There have been quite a lot of downloads. So I provide an OBJ quad file of Sol's arm, and I show a video on how I made the socket for it. So lots of people have downloaded. I think we're at 88 downloads now, I think, something like that. So there's a lot of people having a go at doing it, but they don't tend to contact me and ask for help. So they're just kind of, I suppose, doing the same that I did, looking for resources that they can grab and trying to see how far they can go on their own. But I would love to be able to make arms for children, but I quickly realized once you've made one arm for a child, what do you do after that? You can't just keep making arms until they're 25. Otherwise, you're not going to help that many people. So it did make sense to me to, give a man a rod rather than give a man a fish.
Yeah. Because would it make sense to have some kind of training or something, some kind of thing? Because it makes sense that you're learning a lot of things that are, really very, very valuable to a very specific community, right? And but also to the wider world, maybe not so interesting, but maybe interesting in the way that the process explains itself or something. So, sharing that.
The human interest side of the story it goes down very well with the public. There's been, I think, 6 short films made. You can find them all on our YouTube. So there's definitely an interest in the story and how the technology can be used to help little children. But I would like it to be so much more than that. I wish I had the energy and the money to put in myself, but at the moment we're doing quite well. In fact, on the way up to COVID in March 2020, I was getting about one booking every 2 or 3 months, and I've had one this year, and there hasn't been any for the last 3 years. So trying to restart that, because once my finances mean that I can stay in the office and working on this, then I can keep on innovating, but I can't do that if I'm, trying to get a bill-paying job. So the most important thing to me at the moment is to try and pick up on the public speaking, to try and bring in some income, and then I can give away more files and more advice, more training.
Okay. Oh, that sounds very valuable. And are there skills or are there partners you're looking for? You managed working with a bunch of companies before and all of that stuff. Is there ideally a material partner you're looking for or something like that? Or
I'm too fickle. I jump as soon as something new comes out that's better, I will abandon it. So I don't want any long-standing partners with anybody who I might later drop. And technology moves so quickly. But it would have been nice to do more with HP. I think that there are other companies that are getting into multi-jet fusion, such as Open Bionics, which are a lot better funded, a lot more marketing money available, and a lot more sales behind them. So I imagine if companies wanted to pick somebody to work with, I would be quite low on the list.
Okay. All right. And how do you? I mean, you seem to Can you activate a lot of these other parents and make them do a bunch of work for you, or you're just you seem to be doing this kind of you're by yourself, kind of mostly. You're the author of this mostly, right?
Yes. Sadly, it's one of the saddest things that happens is when we might start to make progress with a family that lethargy kicks in. It is very tiring when somebody's got a full-time job and they're trying to learn how to 3D print. I know it is entirely possible because I've taught people in 3 months to do pretty much everything that I do, but it has to come from the parent. This isn't knowledge that I can just put in someone's head. It takes practice. It takes time. And sadly, and not a lot of families that I've worked with, I think 4, in fact, have gone on to replicate what I've done. Actually, go ahead, get the 3D printers, get the scanner, make the socket, and start making things for the end of it. There are only 4 other families out of is it 60 families, 64 families, I think I've helped.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not a great. I think the technology will become easier and more intuitive,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps maybe I can streamline the workflow and make it even simpler. But I think the initial perception is this is a really steep mountain, and people have a go, and they get to base camp 1, and then you don't hear from them again.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what happens in those cases where families fall off, but
Mm-hmm.
it can be done, and it can be done successfully
Mm-hmm.
on quite a low budget. In fact, for less than the cost of a privately purchased device, you can set yourself up with a home workshop that can do all of this. But that has to be done under the eye of a prosthetist, as far as I'm concerned, or at least an OT or somebody in medicine to be able to check that the socket isn't causing problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. That's very interesting to me. And what do you hope to achieve, like, going forward? What's your goal with this?
To teach Sol, so that Sol and my son Dax, who's probably showing more of a flair for engineering than Sol at the moment, but that they'll both go on and do this as well. That Sol will be making his own arms and inventing his own things and using 3D printers himself one day. So he is very interested in doing it, but it's too easy for Dad. He'll come in and say, "Dad, I need new rubber grips on the fingers," and goes to bed, and he wakes up and there it is the next morning, the arm's all been prepared, or a new socket's been added, the magic fairies came in the middle of the night. But that he's starting to see what goes into it.
Okay,
and,
so it seems like
he's done a few sessions with
and
me on
what have
Fusion
been
360.
the most difficult
I think it's going
challenges
to be a
for you
while
along the
before
way?
he's
Was it
making
the
sockets.
learning the 3D
He's only
printing,
7.
learning the engineering, learning the CAD? What's been the most difficult for you?
Oh, that is a good question. Trying to do all of this and keep my partner happy with the low income I've been receiving since Sol was born. I think what I'd really love to do, as I say, is to try and eke out some kind of a career in prosthetics. I think it's something that I'm passionate about. I think I have a lot to offer between working with myself and Sol and the other children that I've helped. But what I would really love it is if I could somehow manage to wrangle meetings with children's hospitals in the US, across Europe. Shriners, for example, would be a fantastic support partner. But for me, the hardest thing is the frustration of having an idea and not being able to execute it as easily as I would have liked to.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. Okay. Cool. But this is a really inspirational story. This is a really wonderful story. I really think it's really your perseverance and the way you pursued this, and also the discovery of that getting to this early really matters. I think is very, very exciting.
Yeah, I think it was very lucky that I'd studied psychology, and particularly the first few years of development, even inside the womb. And there were a lot of things that were, I think, being overlooked. I think too much focus was given on what we can offer effectively rather than the optimal time to intervene for, for the long term.
Okay. All right. And so thank you so much for being here today, Ben. Thank you so much for being for sharing your story with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great opportunity. Thanks.
And Brent, thank you for being there as well.
Oh, this was great, and I really hope that parents and other prosthetists listen to Ben's story, and there's definitely plenty to glean from it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, dudes. And thank you guys for listening as well. This is another episode of our podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it. Tell other people around about it, and we love doing this. So I hope you love listening. And have a wonderful day.